The day Clara Dalton walked into the only law office in Harlan Creek, Texas, carrying a deed pressed flat against her chest like a shield, every man in town said she was wasting her time, and every one of those men was wrong. It was the spring of 1882, and the land west of the Brazos River was still being carved up between the ambitious, the ruthless, and the lucky. Clara was none of those things, or so people assumed when they looked at her. A widow of 31, with sunburned hands, a dress that had seen better years, and a 5-year-old boy trailing behind her named Henry, who wore his father's old hat in a way that made grown men look away because the sight of it was so heartbreaking. But Clara had something that none of those men accounted for. She had the original deed to 420 acres of the most productive grazing land in Calhoun County, signed by her late husband Thomas Dalton, registered at the county office in 1876, and her name was on it too. Right there. Clara E. Dalton, inked in black and sealed with the county stamp. The problem, as she would come to understand with a fury that settled cold and deep in her chest, was that Harlan Creek and the Honorable Judge Abner Fitch did not particularly care what was written on paper when the person holding that paper was a woman. She had first tried to settle the matter herself, walking up to the offices of Gerald Crane, who had taken to telling people that the Dalton land now belonged to him by right of a debt Thomas had never actually incurred. Gerald Crane was the kind of man who wore expensive boots and a gold pocket watch, and spoke with the slow confidence of someone who had never once been told no. He had offered Clara $60 and a ride to the nearest train station. She had told him, very clearly and without raising her voice, that she would see him in court first. The law office of Milton Lawson sat above the feed store on the main street of Harlan Creek, accessible by a narrow wooden staircase that groaned with every step. The sign outside was small and slightly crooked, reading simply, M. Lawson, Attorney at Law. Clara had heard his name from old Pete Granger at the dry goods store, who had said that Milton Lawson was the only lawyer in 3 counties who had not been bought by Gerald Crane's money, and also that he had a reputation for being stubborn enough to argue with a brick wall and win. Clara did not know if that last part was true, but she needed stubborn right now more than she needed anything else in the world. She knocked twice, and a voice told her to come in. Milton Lawson was 29 years old, though something in the steadiness of his dark eyes made him seem older, and something in the slight unguarded softness of his expression when he was not paying attention made him seem younger. He was seated at a desk buried under enough papers and case files to build a small fort, with his jacket hung on the back of his chair and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had dark hair that he kept somewhat controlled but never quite managed, and a jaw that carried 3 days of stubble because he routinely forgot about things like shaving when he was working through a legal problem. He looked up when Clara came in, and then he looked down at her boy Henry, and then he stood up, which was more than most men in Harlan Creek had done when a woman entered the room. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, because old Pete had apparently mentioned she might be coming, "please sit down." "I would rather stand," Clara said. "I have been sitting in waiting rooms for 2 weeks, and I am done with sitting." "Fair enough," Milton said, and he sat back down himself, which she had not expected. He folded his hands on the desk. "Tell me what happened," so she told him. She told him about Thomas dying of a fever in November of the previous year, about the cattle they had built up from a herd of 12 to nearly 200, about the way Gerald Crane had shown up at her door in January with a piece of paper she had never seen before, claiming Thomas had borrowed $3,000 from him in 1880 and signed over the land as collateral. She told him about going to Judge Fitch, who had looked at her with a kind of patient condescension and explained that these matters were complicated and that perhaps she should find a male relative to assist her. She told him she had no male relatives within 500 miles, and Judge Fitch had looked at her as though that were somehow her own failing. She set the deed on Milton's desk and watched him read it. He read it carefully, the way a person reads something they intend to actually use rather than just look at. He turned it over. He held it toward the light from the window. He read the registration number in the lower corner and wrote it down on a notepad. Henry had grown bored and was looking at the row of legal books along the wall with the kind of focused curiosity that 5-year-olds apply to everything. "The debt document Crane produced," Milton said without looking up. "Have you seen a copy of it?" Judge Fitch showed it to me for approximately 30 seconds. "Did Thomas's signature look right to you?" Clara hesitated. She had thought about this a great deal. "It looked like someone had practiced it," she said carefully. "Thomas always pressed hard with a pen. The ink ran thick at the start of each letter. On that document the signature was thin and even all the way through." Milton looked up then, and for the first time there was something in his eyes that was not just professional attention. It was the look of a man who had just heard something genuinely important. "That is very observant," he said. "I was married to the man for 9 years," Clara said. "I know how he held a pen." Milton was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing she had not dared to hope for. "I will take your case." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything Clara had been carrying since November, the grief and the cold and the sleepless nights, and the humiliation of being talked over and looked through and shuffled out of rooms. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. "You should know," she said, keeping her voice steady with great effort, "that Harlan Creek Court has never once ruled in favor of a woman in a land dispute." "I am aware," Milton said. "Crane has money and Judge Fitch has his own interests." "Also aware." "Then why?" she asked. Because she needed to know. Because she had learned in the months since Thomas died that things rarely happen for free, and kindness from men in positions of power almost always had a price attached beneath the surface. Milton looked at her for a moment, and she had the feeling he was being very honest when he said, "Because you have a valid deed, a forged signature, and a legitimate legal claim, and if this court refuses to honor that, then I want to be on the record as the man who made the argument. And because," he added more quietly, "it is the right thing to do." Clara Dalton looked at Milton Lawson for a long moment, measuring the truth of him the way she measured everything now, not with hope, but with careful, hard-won attention. Then she nodded once. "When do we start?" The preparation for the case took 3 weeks, and those 3 weeks changed things between them in ways that neither of them was looking for and both of them noticed. Milton came out to the Dalton land on the 3rd day, riding a bay horse that was somewhat more sensible than its owner, who had apparently packed his saddlebags with 4 law books, 2 notebooks, a bottle of ink, and absolutely no food for the journey. Clara saw him coming up the long track from the main road while she was mending a section of fence on the east pasture, and she watched him dismount with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who has spent more time in courtrooms than in saddles. Henry charged toward him from around the side of the barn like a small cannonball, and Milton caught him instinctively and set him back on his feet with a steadying hand, and Henry looked up at him with wide eyes and said, "Are you the lawyer?" "I am," Milton said. "Mama says you are going to fight for our land." "I am going to try very hard," Milton said, which Clara thought was the right answer because it was honest without being discouraging. She showed him the land, all of it. They walked the eastern boundary along the creek line, and she pointed out the stakes Thomas had placed, still solid in the ground after 6 years. She showed him the grazing pastures and the small herd of cattle she had been managing alone since November with the help of her ranch hand, a quiet 40-year-old man named Emmett Rays, who had been with Thomas since the beginning and had stayed on out of loyalty to both of them. She showed Milton the barn, the house, the root cellar, the water rights from the creek that were also documented in the deed. "Crane wants the creek access," Milton said. It was not a question. He had been studying the terrain with the focused attention of someone building a map in his head. "His land runs north of mine. The creek curves south onto my property for nearly a mile. Without access to that water, his pasture land is significantly less valuable. So the debt claim is not really about a debt. The debt never existed, Clara said flatly. Milton nodded slowly, looking out at the creek where the afternoon light was turning the water to hammered copper. Do you have Thomas's account books, bank records? Everything, she said. Thomas kept meticulous records. He always said a man who does not write things down is a man who will be surprised later. He was right, Milton said quietly, and then he looked at her. You have been managing all of this alone. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It sat somewhere in between, and Clara felt the weight of it in a way she had not expected. I have, she said, with Henry and Emmett. He did not say anything else on the subject, but he held her gaze for a moment too long for it to be merely professional, and then he looked back at the creek, and Clara felt something warm move through her that she immediately and firmly instructed herself to put aside. She was a widow. She had a court case to win. She did not have the luxury of warmth. Over the following days, Milton came back 4 more times. He went over the account books with the devotion of a man reading scripture, cross-referencing every entry with the dates on the supposed debt document. He found what he was looking for on the 7th day of preparation. In October of 1880, which was the month the alleged loan had supposedly been made, Thomas Dalton had been in Abilene at a cattle fair, documented by 3 independent receipts and a letter from a seller that Clara had saved in the tin box under the bed. It was logistically impossible for Thomas to have met with Gerald Crane in Harlan Creek and signed a document on the 18th of October when he was 40 miles away. When Milton showed her what he had found, sitting at her kitchen table with the papers spread out between them in the lamplight, Clara put her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes for a moment. "This is enough," he said quietly. "Is it?" she asked, because she had stopped trusting enough a long time ago. "With the signature analysis and the alibi records, yes, it should be more than enough." He paused. "In a court that operates on logic and law, it would be a clear case." "And Judge Fitch," Milton was quiet for a moment. "Judge Fitch will not be able to ignore documented evidence presented before a public record. He can be biased, but he cannot be entirely reckless. There will be people watching. I intend to make sure of that." Clara looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning low between them, and the night sounds of the ranch came through the open window, the distant cattle and the creek and the wind in the grass. "What do you mean?" "I have written to the county newspaper in San Antonio," Milton said. "They have agreed to send a correspondent to cover the proceedings. A case involving a disputed land deed and a potentially forged signature is interesting enough news. And when there is a journalist in the courtroom taking notes, Judge Fitch becomes considerably more careful about how he conducts himself." Clara stared at him. "You planned that?" "I planned several things," he said, and there was a quiet satisfaction in his voice that was not arrogance exactly, but something close to it, the confidence of a man who had been several steps ahead and had not mentioned it because he did not need credit, only results. "That is," she said, choosing the word carefully, "surprisingly clever." He looked up at her and his expression shifted into something that was almost a smile. Not quite, but almost. "You sound surprised." "I am revising my expectations upward," she said. This time he did smile, and it transformed his face in a way she had not anticipated. It was the kind of smile that lived mostly in the eyes and arrived slowly, as though it had been waiting for the right moment. Clara looked at it for one unguarded second and then looked down at the papers on the table. Henry appeared in the doorway of the bedroom in his nightshirt, rubbing his eyes and announcing that he could not sleep because there were voices. Clara rose to take him back to bed, and Milton gathered his papers quietly, and when she came back to the kitchen he was putting on his jacket to leave. "We will be ready," he said. "I know," she said, and she realized as she said it that she meant it. The night before the trial, Milton sat alone in his office above the feed store with every document laid out in the order he intended to present them. He had tried 3 significant cases in his career: a contract dispute in Austin, a property line argument in Fort Worth, and a fraudulent sale in Galveston. He had won all three. But this felt different in a way that he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge had something to do with the woman whose name was at the center of it. He had not gone looking for this. He was not the kind of man who went looking for anything outside of the law. He had come to Harlan Creek 2 years ago from Austin, drawn partly by the low cost of setting up practice, and partly by the kind of vague restlessness that a man feels when the city he lives in no longer seems to fit him. He had built a modest but honest practice, taken on straightforward cases, lived alone above the feed store with his books and his coffee pot and a cat named Precedent who had wandered in one winter and never left. Clara Dalton had walked into his office and changed the shape of his days without apparently trying to do so. He admired her. That was the simple truth of it. He admired the way she managed the land and the boy and the grief all at once, without complaining, without pretending it was easy, without asking for sympathy she clearly did not want. He admired the precision of her thinking, the way she remembered details that would have escaped most people, the way she looked at him when he explained something as though she was not merely listening, but actively measuring the quality of what he said. She was sharp and careful and completely unwilling to be diminished, and Milton Lawson, who had spent most of his adult life in rooms full of men who spoke over each other, found that he would rather listen to Clara Dalton think out loud than do almost anything else he could name. He was also deeply aware that she was his client, that she was still in the early months of widowhood, and that the most important thing he could do for her right now was win this case. He folded that awareness around everything else and went back to his papers. Emmett Reyes knocked on the office door at 9:30 that evening, which surprised Milton considerably, and when he came in he stood with his hat in his hands and his expression very serious. "Thought you should know," Emmett said. "Two of Crane's men rode past the Dalton place this evening, slow, looking." Milton felt something cold move through him. "Did they stop?" "No, but they were looking. Clara and Henry are inside. I stayed until dark. They are fine, but I thought you should know that Crane is nervous." "Good," Milton said, and he was surprised by the edge in his own voice. A nervous man makes mistakes. After Emmett left, Milton wrote a careful note to the county sheriff, documenting the incident, and sent it with the overnight mail. Then he sat for a long time in the lamplight thinking about Clara, and the case, and the particular weight of something that matters far too much. The trial of Dalton versus Crane began on a Tuesday morning in April, 1882, in the Calhoun County courthouse, which was a square building of pale limestone that managed to look both authoritative and slightly bored. The courtroom held perhaps 60 people in its benches, and every single one of those seats was filled by the time the proceedings began. Word had spread, the way word always spreads in small towns, with speed and elaboration, and the correspondent from the San Antonio newspaper, a young man named Ward who wore ink-stained cuffs and carried a shorthand notebook, sat in the front row of the public gallery with the focused expression of someone who knew he was watching something worth writing about. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark blue dress that she had pressed that morning with careful attention, her hair pinned neatly, the deed and the account books and the correspondence from Abilene arranged in front of her. Henry was with Emmett's wife, Maria, who had offered without being asked. Milton sat beside Clara, his case files in order, his expression calm in the way that a river looks calm from a distance, because you cannot see how fast it is actually moving. Gerald Crane sat at the defendant's table with his own lawyer, a man named Hargrove from Corpus Christi, who wore a suit that cost more than Clara's cattle were worth, and had the smoothly confident air of a man who won cases by making the other side seem small. Judge Abner Fitch took his seat with the deliberate slowness of a man who was aware of the significance of everything he did. He was in his late 50s, heavyset, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent authority. He looked at the gallery, at the journalist, and then at Clara, and something moved through his expression too quickly for Milton to read it. "This court will come to order," Judge Fitch said. Hargrove went first, because Crane was the defendant and the opening position favored the established claim. He spoke for 20 minutes in the smooth, unhurried way of an expensive lawyer, explaining that Thomas Dalton had borrowed money in good faith, that the debt was properly documented, and that the transfer of land in lieu of repayment was a standard and legal arrangement. He referred to Clara twice as the widow Dalton, in a tone that made it sound like a category rather than a person. Then Milton stood up. He was not the loudest man in the room. He was not the most dramatic. He did not raise his voice or wave papers or perform the way Hargrove had. He spoke in a clear, even tone that carried to every corner of the courtroom because the room was very quiet, and the room was quiet because something in how he spoke made people want to listen. He laid out the case in order. The registered deed with Clara's name on it, the account books showing no record of any debt, the letter and the 3 receipts placing Thomas Dalton in Abilene on the 18th of October, 1880, the date the debt document claimed he had signed it. He placed each document on the evidence table as he mentioned it, turning each one so that Judge Fitch could read it clearly. "The plaintiff, Mrs. Clara Dalton," Milton said, not the widow but her name, and he said it with the same weight he would have given any other plaintiff in any other case, "has presented documented evidence that the signature on the defendant's debt claim could not have been made by Thomas Dalton on the date recorded, as Thomas Dalton was 40 miles away on that date, a fact corroborated by 3 independent receipts and a letter of sale, all of which I am entering into the record." He paused, and the courtroom was so quiet that the creak of the building settling in the morning heat was audible. "Furthermore," he said, "the plaintiff, who was married to Thomas Dalton for 9 years and was familiar with the specific characteristics of his handwriting, will testify that the signature on the debt document does not match the pressure and style of Thomas Dalton's established hand. This is supported by a comparison with 17 documented samples of Thomas Dalton's signature across the account books and registered documents, copies of which I have provided to the court." Hargrove objected twice. Milton answered both objections with specific legal citations, delivered from memory without consulting his notes, which had an effect on the gallery that was almost physical. People leaned forward. Ward, the journalist's pencil was moving constantly. Clara testified with the steadiness of a woman who has been afraid before and decided to keep going anyway. She answered every question Milton asked with precision and clarity. When Hargrove cross-examined her, trying to suggest that she had insufficient understanding of her late husband's business affairs, she looked at him calmly and said, "I kept the accounts. I managed the ranch books from the 3rd year of our marriage because Thomas's handwriting was poor and my arithmetic was better. I am familiar with every financial transaction Thomas Dalton made from 1876 to the day he died." The gallery stirred. Someone in the back row made a sound that was half laugh and half approval. Judge Fitch looked at Clara. He looked at the documents. He looked at Gerald Crane, who had gone slightly pale. He looked at Ward, the journalist, who had not stopped writing. Milton called Emmett Reyes, who testified with the direct simplicity of an honest man that he had worked for the Daltons since 1876 and had never once heard Thomas mention a debt to Gerald Crane. He called the postmaster of Harlan Creek, who confirmed that a certified letter addressed to Gerald Crane had been delivered from the Abilene Cattle Fair Association, confirming Thomas Dalton's registration at the October 1880 fair. He called the bank manager, who confirmed that the Dalton account showed no large deposits consistent with a $3,000 loan in 1880. Hargrove's case, which had looked smooth and expensive in the morning, had developed significant cracks by mid-afternoon. He called Gerald Crane to the stand, and Crane testified with the wounded dignity of a man who was unaccustomed to being doubted. But when Milton cross-examined him, asking him to describe in precise detail the circumstances of the supposed loan, including where it had taken place, who had been present as witnesses, and how the money had been conveyed, Crane's answers were vague in the specific places where they should have been concrete and concrete in the places where vagueness would have served him better. You state that Thomas Dalton came to your home office on the 18th of October, 1880, Milton said. At what time? Morning, Crane said. What time in the morning? 9 o'clock or thereabouts. And how did Mr. Dalton arrive on horseback? Yes. And the money, $3,000. In what form was it conveyed? Crane hesitated. Cash. A large sum to carry in cash. Was it in a bag, an envelope? A bag. And who else was present in your office at this time? Another hesitation. My bookkeeper. Your bookkeeper, Milton repeated. And what is your bookkeeper's name? Crane said the name of a man who, as Milton proceeded to demonstrate with a document he produced from his case file, had left Harlan Creek in June of 1880 to take a position in Dallas and had not returned. He could not have been present at a meeting in October of the same year. The courtroom made a sound that was not quite a sound, a collective held breath that became a collective slow exhalation. Judge Fitch called a recess. During the recess, Clara and Milton stood in the narrow hallway outside the courtroom and did not speak for a moment. She was looking at the floor with an expression he could not entirely read, and he was watching her face without meaning to. How do you think it is going? She said finally. Honestly, always. I think we have made the case, he said. The question now is what Judge Fitch decides to do with it. She looked up at him. You mean whether he will do the legal thing or the convenient thing? Yes. She was quiet again. Then she said very quietly, Thank you, whatever happens. Nothing has happened yet, he said, and she looked at him with an expression that shifted through several things very quickly and settled on something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to make his chest feel strange. Milton, she said, using his first name for the first time, and he was aware of the exact moment she did it. Whatever happens, you have done something today that no one else in this county was willing to do. You treated my claim as if it deserved to be treated seriously. You treated me as if I deserved to be treated seriously. That matters, regardless of the outcome. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, You deserve considerably more than that, Mrs. Dalton. She held his gaze. The hallway was loud with the murmur of people around them, and somehow it felt entirely private. Clara, she said. Clara, he said. They went back into the courtroom. Judge Fitch returned to the bench with the deliberate slowness of a man who had spent the recess making a decision he had not expected to have to make. He looked at the documents on the evidence table. He looked at Gerald Crane. He looked at Ward, the journalist, who had his notebook open and his pencil ready. This court, Judge Fitch said, in a voice that carried the weight of someone who was choosing his words with uncommon care, finds that the documentary evidence presented by the plaintiff is consistent and credible. The debt document presented by the defendant contains a signature that this court cannot verify as authentic, in light of the corroborating evidence that places Thomas Dalton outside of Calhoun County on the date in question. Furthermore, the witness testimony offered in support of the defendant's claim has been substantially undermined. He paused. The courtroom was absolutely still. The original deed to the property described in this action, registered in 1876, stands as valid. The claim of Gerald Crane upon said property is not substantiated by the evidence before this court. Judgment is entered for the plaintiff. The sound that came out of the gallery was something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, not just the relief and the raised voices and the exclamation of approval from somewhere in the back, but the specific, precise feeling of hearing a room full of people react to justice being done when they had not expected it. She sat very still for one moment. Then she pressed her hand flat against the deed in front of her, feeling the paper under her palm, and breathed. Milton was standing. He was gathering documents with the focused efficiency of a man who has trained himself not to show too much, but his hands were not entirely steady, and when he looked at Clara, she saw in his face the thing he was working very hard not to let be too visible, and it was relief so large it was almost something else entirely. Clara, he said quietly. "I heard," she said, and her voice came out with a catch in it that she had not planned for and did not apologize for. "I heard." Gerald Crane left the courtroom without speaking to anyone, which was, Clara thought, the closest he would ever come to an acknowledgement. Hargrove gathered his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man who was already thinking about the next case. Ward the journalist approached Milton with several questions, which Milton answered carefully and on the record, and Clara stood listening and thought that this moment, exactly this moment, was the one she would describe to Henry when he was old enough to understand what had happened in a courtroom in Harlan Creek in April of 1882. Outside the courthouse, Emmett Reyes was waiting on the steps, and when he saw their faces he removed his hat and said something quiet in Spanish that Clara did not fully understand but felt completely. Several other people from town came forward, some to congratulate Clara and some simply to stand near her, as though proximity to this outcome was something they wanted to be associated with. Old Pete Granger shook Milton's hand with both of his and said, "I told her you were the right man." "She made the right case," Milton said simply. The day after the trial, Clara rode out to check the eastern boundary fence in the pale early morning light, just her and the horse and the sound of the creek and the open sky. She needed to feel the land under her. She needed to touch the fence posts and hear the water and be sure it was all still there, all still real, all still hers. She was tightening a wire on the third post when she heard hooves and looked up to see Milton riding toward her along the creek line. He pulled up a few feet away and dismounted, and she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something that she was no longer trying as hard to set aside. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Did you follow me out here?" "I came to check on you," he said, which was honest and slightly embarrassed at the same time, and she found both of those things appealing. "I am fine," she said. "I know you are," he said. "You are arguably the most capable person I have encountered in this county. I came to check on you anyway." She looked at him. The morning was very clear and the creek was talking quietly to itself and the grass was still wet with dew. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Then he looked back at her. "Because yesterday mattered to me," he said, "professionally and otherwise. And because I find that I think about you considerably more than I should, given that I am your lawyer and you are recently widowed and I am aware of both of those things." Clara set down the wire fence tool she was holding. She looked at him with the careful, precise attention she gave to things that mattered. "How recently is recently?" she said. "Thomas has been gone since November. I loved him. I grieved him, and I am still grieving him in ways that do not go away. But I am 31 years old and I am still here, and I know the difference between a man who sees me as an inconvenience and a man who sees me." "I see you," Milton said, very quietly. "I know you do," she said, equally quietly. "I noticed. I have been noticing for 3 weeks." The creek moved past them. A hawk turned slow circles above the eastern pasture. Milton Lawson took one step toward Clara Dalton, and she did not step back, and for a long moment they simply stood in the morning light looking at each other with the full awareness of two people who have just made a decision. "I would very much like to call on you," he said. "Properly. With Henry's knowledge and Emmett's awareness and whatever other protocols apply." The corner of her mouth moved. "You are very formal for a man standing in a field at 6 in the morning." "I am trying to do this correctly," he said. "Milton," she said, "you have been doing everything correctly since the moment I walked into your office. I think you can stop worrying about correctly and start worrying about honestly." He looked at her. "Honestly, then, I would like to know you better. I would like to have the chance to be in your life in a way that is not strictly professional. I would like if you are willing to see where this goes." "Yes," Clara said simply. He breathed out slowly as though he had been holding something. "Good," he said. The weeks that followed were quiet and steady, and full of the particular texture of two people discovering each other without hurry. Milton came to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, and gradually the visits extended through supper, and gradually supper became the kind of long, comfortable meal where the food gets cold, because the conversation has gone somewhere interesting. He read to Henry from the adventure books he kept in his office, sitting on the porch steps in the summer evening light with the boy pressed against his side, and Clara watched them from the kitchen doorway sometimes without letting either of them know she was there. He brought her a copy of a legal text she had mentioned wanting to read, carried it out on horseback wrapped in brown paper against the dust, and she read it in 3 evenings and told him exactly what she thought of the arguments in Chapter 7, which led to an argument of their own that lasted half an hour and that both of them enjoyed enormously. He was the kind of man who listened when she spoke. This was not as common as it should have been, and Clara was aware of that, and it meant more to her than she could easily say out loud. She told him about Thomas one evening in early June, sitting on the porch with coffee while Henry slept inside. She told him about how they had met, about the early years of building the ranch from almost nothing, about the way Thomas had been a good man and a good husband even though he had not always been an easy one. She told him about the fever, about the week of watching someone she loved leave her by degrees, about the morning in November when she had walked out to the barn in the frost and known that she was alone now. Milton listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering comfort she had not asked for, without filling the quiet with words that would have been easier than silence. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like a man worth grieving." "He was," she said. And then, "But I am not only grief." "I know," Milton said. "You have made that abundantly clear." She looked at him sideways. "Is that a complaint?" "It is one of my favorite things about you," he said. She looked at him fully then, and the evening light was warm and the crickets had started in the grass and Henry was safe inside and the land was hers, documented and registered and proven, and Clara Dalton felt something she had not expected to feel again in quite this form, the particular gravity of another person pulling at the center of her. "Milton," she said. "Clara, I am going to say something and I need you to let me finish before you respond." "All right." "I did not come to your office looking for anything except a lawyer. I was not in any state to be looking for anything else, and I was not particularly interested in it. But you have been in my life for 2 months now, and in that time I have come to rely on you in ways that go past the case, and I have come to value you in ways I did not expect, and I am telling you this because I think you should know where I stand before this goes any further." He was very still. "Where do you stand?" he said. "I stand considerably closer to you than I expected to," she said. He turned toward her. In the fading evening light, his face was open and unguarded in a way she had only seen occasionally, those unplanned moments when he forgot to be careful. "Clara," he said, "I have been trying very hard not to move faster than you are comfortable with." "I appreciate that," she said, "but I am comfortable now." He reached out and took her hand from her coffee cup, very gently, as though the gesture might be declined, and he was prepared for that. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that on the porch while the evening settled into night, and it was the most peaceful Clara had felt since before Thomas died. There was the matter of Gerald Crane to be resolved, which was not the most romantic thread in Clara's life that summer, but was a necessary one. 2 weeks after the trial, Crane had filed a motion to appeal the judgment, which Milton had answered with a 17-page legal response that Ward, the journalist, who had by now published a substantial account of the original trial in the San Antonio paper, apparently described in print as meticulous and unassailable. The appeal was denied in July by the district court, which reviewed the evidence independently and found no basis for overturning Judge Fitch's ruling. When Milton brought her the notice of the appeal's denial, riding out to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with the paper tucked into his coat, Clara read it standing in the yard and then looked up at him and said, "Is it finished?" "It is finished," he said. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "I need to check the north fence line this afternoon. Do you want to come?" "Yes," he said immediately, which made her smile. They rode out together in the warm July afternoon, 2 horses side by side along the creek, and Emmett, who was working on the barn roof and saw them go, watched them ride away, and said something to himself with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has seen how things are going and is glad of it. By August, everyone in Harlan Creek knew that the widow Dalton and the lawyer Lawson had an understanding, which was the word the town used for something that was clearly more than friendship, and not yet anything they could point to officially. Clara did not particularly care what the town called it. She had stopped arranging her life around the comfort of other people's opinions sometime around the second week of fighting Crane's claim alone, and she had not gone back. What she cared about was this. On an evening in late August when the heat had finally begun to soften at the edges and Henry was asleep and Emmett and Maria had gone home for the night, Milton sat on her porch with her in the dark and said, "I keep thinking about the future." "In what direction?" she asked. "In the direction of you," he said. "And Henry, and this land, and whether you might be willing to consider a future that includes me in a more permanent way." Clara looked out at the dark yard and the stars above the pasture and the shape of the barn against the sky. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the practical way she thought about everything, turning it over and examining it from all sides. A second marriage, a different shape to her life, a man who had proven himself not with words but with actions that cost him something. "Henry already calls you Milton," she said. "He does. He asked me last week if you were going to live here." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I did not know yet." She looked at Milton. "I know now." He was very still. "Tell me." "Yes," she said. "I am willing, more than willing," he exhaled. He reached for her hand the way he had on the porch in June, with that same careful gentleness, and she gave it to him. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say that, and I have concluded that there is no right moment. There is only the truth, and the truth is that I love you." "I love you," she said, and it came out more easily than she had expected, more completely than she had thought it would, as though the words had been ready for a while and had only been waiting for her to open the door. He pulled her close and she let him, leaning into him in the August dark with the crickets singing and the cattle settling, and all the weight of the past year held quietly between them, honored and set down at the same time. They were married in October, just over a year after Thomas had died, and 6 months after Clara had first climbed the groaning staircase to Milton Lawson's office. The ceremony was held on the ranch, in front of the barn, on a morning with a sky so blue it looked painted. Emmett stood up with Milton and Maria stood with Clara, and Henry wore a new suit that Clara had sewed herself and managed to keep clean for approximately 45 minutes. The minister from the First Methodist Church performed the ceremony with the gentle formality of a man who understood that this particular wedding was not only joyful but also hard one. When Milton put his ring on Clara's finger, he held her hand in both of his for a moment before letting go, and she looked up at him with a clarity she had not felt in years, something settled and certain and entirely her own. The guests were small in number but significant in warmth. Old Pete Granger came, and Ward the journalist, who had made a trip out from San Antonio specifically for the occasion, and said he intended to write a small note about it in his paper. Judge Fitch was not invited and did not appear to notice. Gerald Crane had left Harlan Creek shortly after the appeal was denied, having sold his northern property at a considerable loss to a cattle company from Houston. No one mourned his departure. After the ceremony, while the small gathering ate around tables set up in the shade of the live oaks, Henry climbed onto Milton's lap and announced with the unambiguous directness of a 6-year-old that he was going to call him Pa now, if that was all right. Milton looked at him for a moment with an expression that Clara saw from across the yard, and that made her press her fingers against her lips for a moment to keep herself composed. "That is more than all right," Milton said, and he put his arm around Henry with the same steadiness he put into everything, and that was that. The autumn and winter of 1882 into 1883 brought the ranch into a new season in every sense. Milton kept his law practice in town, but spent his evenings and his weekends at the ranch, riding the boundaries with Emmett, learning the work of the land in the way that a man learns something not because it is required, but because he wants to understand the life of the person he loves. He was not a natural horseman, and he was not a natural cattleman, but he was a determined learner, and by spring he could mend a fence line without assistance, and could read the health of the grazing land with a reasonable eye. Clara, for her part, learned to read his legal documents with a fluency that surprised him, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with Henry asleep, and the lamp burning warm, asking questions that cut straight to the center of whatever problem he was working on. He started consulting her habitually on his cases, not in any formal sense but in the way a person thinks out loud to the one who understands them best, and her answers were so consistently useful that he told her one evening that she should have been a lawyer. "The profession does not currently accommodate me," she said. "It should," he said, with a quiet certainty that she recognized as the same tone he had used in the courtroom, and she believed him. In the spring of 1883, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Milton on a Sunday morning while he was sitting at the kitchen table going over a land survey, and she was standing at the stove with her back to him, and she said it in the careful, measured way she said important things, giving it room rather than rushing it. He was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara," and when she turned around his face had the same unguarded quality she had first seen in the hallway outside the courtroom before the verdict, when relief was too large to fully contain. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she let herself lean into him the way she had learned to do, without losing any of herself in the process. "Are you glad?" she asked against his shoulder. "I am more glad than I know how to say," he said. The baby was born in November, exactly 2 years after Thomas had died, which Clara noticed with a quiet, private sense of the way time turns things over and offers something new in the space left by what has been lost. The baby was a boy, born healthy and loud in the way that healthy babies announce themselves, and they named him James Thomas Lawson, the Thomas for the man who had built the land and the James for Milton's father, who had died when Milton was young, and who he did not often speak of but thought about more than he showed. Henry met his brother with the solemn gravity of a 7-year-old undertaking a serious responsibility, and within 3 days had appointed himself the baby's primary guardian, and was taking the role with absolute commitment. Milton watched him holding James on the porch, sitting very still with the infant carefully arranged in his arms and the expression of someone entrusted with something irreplaceable, and said quietly to Clara, "He is going to be remarkable." "He already is," Clara said. The following years were not without hardship, because nothing in Calhoun County in the 1880s was without hardship. There was a dry summer in 1884 that tested the cattle and the pasture. There was a dispute with a neighboring property in 1885 that Milton handled with the same methodical precision he had applied to Clara's case. There was a winter of sickness that went through the town like a slow fire, taking several people and sparing others seemingly at random, and Clara and Milton sat up through 2 nights with Henry when the fever caught him and did not let go until it chose to. But the land held. The deed remained registered. The cattle grew to a herd that Emmett managed with the quiet expertise of a man who has devoted his life to the work, and finds this satisfying rather than limiting. Milton's practice grew too, quietly and steadily, taking on cases that mattered, occasionally traveling to San Antonio or Austin for district court proceedings, and always coming home to the ranch with the particular relief of a man who knows exactly where he belongs. Clara became, over those years, something that Harlan Creek had not quite had a category for at the start. A woman who ran her own land, managed her own affairs, consulted on her husband's legal work, raised 2 boys who were both somehow completely her and completely their own, and did all of this without asking permission or apology from anyone. The town, which had expected something more conventional, eventually adjusted. Towns do, when presented with a reality they cannot argue with. In 1886, Ward the journalist returned to Harlan Creek for what he described as a follow-up piece on the case that had made the San Antonio paper 4 years earlier. He was older and his cuffs were still ink-stained, and he sat on Clara and Milton's porch on an October afternoon and asked her how she felt about what had happened. Clara thought about it for a genuine moment in the way she thought about things that deserved a genuine moment. Then she said, "I had the right, I had the documentation, I had the law. All of those things existed before Milton took the case. What he did was treat those things as though they were real and worth defending, which is what should have happened from the beginning." Ward wrote that down carefully. "And the case itself," he said, "you see it as more than a personal matter." "My land was always personal," Clara said, "but the principle of it, that a woman's legal claim deserves the same standing as a man's, that is not personal. That is simply correct." Milton was sitting beside her and Ward looked at him. "And you, Mr. Lawson?" Milton was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I took the case because it was right. I kept coming back to that ranch because of a very different reason. Both of those things are true, and I am not embarrassed by either of them." Ward smiled and wrote that down too. The piece appeared in the San Antonio newspaper the following week, occupying a quarter page and describing the Dalton versus Crane case as one of the more notable land rights proceedings in the Western District, and noting that the property in question was now a prosperous and well-established ranch operating under the Lawson name while retaining its original deed. Clara read it at the kitchen table while James, now 3, sat on the floor beside her constructing an elaborate project from sticks, and Henry, now 9, was outside with Emmett learning to check the cattle for hoof health. She set the paper down and looked out the window at the yard and the barn and the east pasture, where the afternoon light was coming in at an angle that made the grass look like it was lit from inside. Milton came in from the back of the house and looked at her looking out the window. "The article," he said. "Yes." He came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and covered one of his hands with hers. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Like something that has been set in the right place." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head with the ease of a man who has been doing this long enough that it is simply the language of his body now, the daily, ordinary, continuous expression of something very large. In 1887, Clara had another pregnancy, which surprised them both pleasantly. This time it was a girl, born in February, pink and opinionated from the very first hour, and they named her Ruth Eleanor Lawson. Henry, at 10, received this information with the resigned dignity of an eldest child, accommodating a further expansion of his family's chaos. James, at 3, stood on his toes to look at the baby and announced that she was small and immediately lost interest in favor of a wooden horse he had left on the floor. Milton held Ruth Eleanor for the first time in the way he had held James, and in the way he had held Henry against his side on the porch steps, with the complete, focused presence of a man who has discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he is very good at this, and finds it one of the best things in his life. "3," Clara said from the bed, watching him with Ruth. "3," he agreed, and looked up at her with the smile that still arrived slowly and lived mostly in his eyes. "You are remarkable." "You have mentioned that before," she said. "It has continued to be true," he said. The spring of 1888 brought changes to Harlan Creek itself, the way the late 1880s brought changes to most of Texas, with the railroad expanding and new settlers arriving, and the old landscape of the Wild West shifting into something that was becoming, slowly and not always gracefully, something more settled. The cattle drives that had defined the region for 20 years were giving way to fenced ranges and rail shipments. The law, which had once been whatever the most powerful man in the room decided it was becoming something more written down and more answerable, though not without resistance. Milton argued 2 more significant cases in that period, one in Austin before the district court that established a clearer precedent for registered deeds against fraudulent claims, and one in Harlan Creek itself, involving a younger widow named Beatrice Shore, whose case bore enough resemblance to Clara's that Clara came to court and sat in the front row of the gallery for all 3 days of proceedings. Milton won that case too. Beatrice Shore kept her land. She was 23 and she had 2 daughters, and she cried in the hallway outside the courtroom in a way that Clara recognized completely. And Clara handed her a handkerchief and said, very simply, "It gets easier. I promise you it gets easier." Beatrice looked at her with the raw, exposed face of someone who has just survived something. "How do you know?" "Because I was where you are 6 years ago," Clara said, "and I am here now." That evening after supper, when Henry was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table and James had fallen asleep on the sofa with the wooden horse still in his hand, and Ruth Eleanor was in her cradle making the small sounds of a baby dreaming, Clara told Milton about the conversation with Beatrice. "She will be all right," Milton said. He was reading a deposition, or trying to, but he had been looking up at Clara more than at the paper. "She will," Clara agreed. "She has the land and the law behind her now. The rest is work. You make everything sound manageable." "Everything is manageable," she said. "Some things simply take longer than others." He set down the deposition. He looked at her across the kitchen in the lamplight. This woman he had known for 6 years now. This woman whose name he had learned first from a deed and then from the depth of his own feeling. And he thought that he would spend the rest of his life grateful for the fact that she had climbed that groaning staircase and knocked on his office door and said she would rather stand. "Clara," he said. "Milton," she said, in the tone that meant she was aware he was about to say something and was giving him the space for it. "I want you to know," he said, "that every good thing in my life, and I mean every significant one, has happened because you walked into my office in the spring of 1882. She considered this with her usual precision. "That is a generous way to see it. It is the accurate way. You would have lived a perfectly reasonable life without me," she said. "Reasonable," he agreed. "But not this, not any of this." He gestured at the sleeping James and the quiet cradle and Henry at the table and the warm kitchen, and beyond it, the land that was theirs now in every sense that mattered, legal and lived in and loved. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she rose from her chair and crossed the kitchen and kissed him in the warm lamplight with the easy certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she stands and has chosen to stand here freely and completely. Henry, without looking up from his schoolwork, said "gross," in the universal tone of a 10-year-old encountering parental affection. Both of them laughed. By 1890, Harlan Creek had grown enough to have a second lawyer, a young man fresh from law school in Austin who set up practice on the opposite end of the main street, and who came to Milton with a nervous formality that made Milton feel considerably older than his 37 years. Milton mentored him with the same thorough attention he gave to everything, and the young man, whose name was Collins, turned out to be good and honest, which was the only qualification Milton cared about. Henry, at 13, had developed an interest in the law that surprised no one who had watched him grow up in a household where the kitchen table was frequently covered in legal documents, and his mother argued case theory while making biscuits. He sat in on sessions when Milton worked at home, asking questions with the focused curiosity that had been in him since he was 5 years old, standing in a law office looking at books on shelves. Milton answered every question, seriously and completely, because he believed that the quality of a person's questions was usually the best indicator of their intelligence, and Henry's questions were excellent. "He is going to be a lawyer," Clara said one evening. "I know," Milton said. He sounded pleased in a way that was entirely unforced. "Are you going to tell him that?" "He already knows," she laughed. "He does, doesn't he?" James, at 7, was less interested in the law and more interested in the cattle, following Emmett around the ranch with the single-minded devotion of a boy who has found his calling early. Emmett, who had no children of his own, took this as the profound compliment it was, and taught him everything with a patient thoroughness that moved Clara whenever she saw them together. Ruth Eleanor, at 3, had opinions about all of it and expressed them continuously. The summer of 1890 was the summer Clara decided to write it all down. She had kept the account books, of course, and the ranch records, and the file of the trial documents that Milton had organized and preserved with the meticulous care of a man who understood that these papers were not just legal records but historical ones. But she had not written the story of it. She sat down one evening in July with a new journal and began from the beginning, from Thomas's fever in November and the cold morning in January, when Crane had come to her door, and the stairs that groaned under her feet, and the lawyer who had stood up when she came in. She wrote for 3 evenings a week throughout that summer, and Milton found her at it one night and read over her shoulder for a moment before she closed the book. "You are writing about the case," he said. "I am writing about all of it," she said. "May I read it when you are done?" "When I am done," she said. "Yes." She finished the journal in October, the same month that marked 8 years since she had won the case, 8 years since she had stood in a limestone courthouse and heard a judge say the words that gave her back what was already hers. She gave the journal to Milton on a Sunday evening while the children were occupied elsewhere, and he read it in 2 sittings, and when he finished he set it down on the kitchen table and did not speak for a moment. "Clara," he said, "it is just the truth," she said. "The truth is," he said, "that you wrote this as if I am the main character." "You are not," she said. "I am." He looked up at her. "Yes," he said, "you are." She reached across the table and took the journal back. "But you are the best part," she said, and she said it in the direct, unadorned way she said things that she had decided to say completely, without softening or qualification, and he looked at her with the same unguarded expression she had first seen in a courthouse hallway and had been grateful for every day since. The years continued. Henry studied law and went to Austin for his schooling in 1894, returning to Harlan Creek with a degree and an ambition to practice, and a young woman named Josephine who he had met in the city, and who was as sharp and direct as his mother, which Clara took as a very good sign. James took over the primary management of the cattle when he turned 18 in 1901, working alongside Emmett with an ease that was almost beautiful to see. The passing of knowledge between an old ranch hand and the boy who had grown up following him around. Ruth Eleanor, who had her mother's precision and her father's determination, went to study at a women's college in San Antonio at 17, and came back full of ideas that made Sunday dinners considerably more interesting. Emmett and Maria had an extra chair at the Lawson table, without anyone ever formally deciding this was the arrangement. It was simply the case, year after year, that they were there, and the food was made for 6, and the conversation moved between Spanish and English with a fluency that the children had absorbed naturally from early childhood. In 1895, old Pete Granger died at the age of 78, peacefully, which was the most that anyone in Calhoun County could reasonably hope for. Clara and Milton attended the service together, and Clara held his hand through the prayers and afterward said to him, walking home along the main street in the autumn afternoon, "He told me you were the right man." "So you have said," Milton said. "He was correct." Milton looked at her sideways. "High praise coming from you." "The highest I have," she said, and squeezed his hand. Judge Abner Fitch retired in 1893 and moved to San Antonio and was replaced by a younger man who had actually studied the district's recent case history and regarded the Dalton versus Crane ruling as a useful precedent. Clara found this satisfying in a purely objective way. She had not been particularly interested in revenge against Fitch. She had been interested in the land and the law, and those were settled. What Fitch did with the rest of his life was his own concern. Gerald Crane was occasionally heard of, in the way that a man who has moved away is occasionally heard of through the mail and the occasional passing traveler. He had eventually settled in Houston and was said to be involved in some kind of shipping business. Clara did not think about him much. He had tried to take what was hers and he had failed, and that was the whole of what he needed to be to her. On the evening of their 15th anniversary in October of 1897, Milton took Clara for a ride along the eastern boundary of the ranch as the sun was going down, just the two of them on horseback the way they had ridden on that first visit when he had looked out at the creek and said, "Crane wants the creek access." The creek was the same. The grass was the same. The land was entirely, irrevocably hers and theirs, and had been for 15 years. They stopped at the same place they had stood on that long-ago morning when he had told her he was revising his expectations upward, and he had smiled, and she had looked at it for one unguarded second. The evening was very warm for October, and the sky was doing extraordinary things with the light, layers of gold and rose and the deep blue beginning at the horizon that would be full night in an hour. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said, because she did know. She always knew what he was going to say in the moments before he said it, which was one of the things that made 15 years feel both impossibly long and barely enough. "I was thinking," he said, "about the day you walked into my office. With your papers everywhere and your cat on the desk. Precedent is a distinguished legal thinker," he said. "Precedent knocked my deed off the desk and sat on it," she said, "as I said. Engaged with the legal proceedings." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the evening pasture and the creek, and he looked at her while she was laughing with the same expression she had first noticed in a courthouse hallway. 15 years compressed into a moment that was itself and all of them at once. "I love you," he said, very simply. "I love you," she said, equally simply, and it was still as true and as complete as it had been the first time she had said it, which was the most important thing she knew about love, that the right kind does not diminish with time. It deepens. It settles into a person the way water settles into good soil, becoming part of the ground itself. They rode back to the house in the last of the light, and the lamps were on in the kitchen, and the sound of Henry's voice and Josephine's and James's, and Ruth Aliner's was coming out through the open windows, and Emmett's laugh, which was a low, warm sound that had been part of the ranch as long as the ranch had been Clara's. She reined in her horse for a moment at the edge of the yard and looked at the house and the barn and the light and listened to the voices. Milton stopped beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking. He waited, because he had learned that when Clara paused like this, she was organizing something important, and the respectful thing was to give her the space for it. "I came into your office with a deed pressed against my chest," she said, "thinking I was fighting for 400 acres. "Yes," he said. "I did not know I was fighting for this," she said. He looked at the house with the same attention she was giving it, the light in the windows and the voices, and the yard where Henry had first charged at him as a 5-year-old, and where they had been married, and where James had learned to walk, and where Ruth Aliner had once spent an entire afternoon commanding the barn cats with the authority of a very small general. "Neither did I," he said, "but I am glad." "So am I," Clara Dalton said, because she was still Clara Dalton in the way that mattered, the name on the deed, the woman who had climbed the groaning stairs, the one who had stood when she could have sat and spoken when she could have been silent, and held the line when every man in Harlan Creek had told her to give it up. She was that, and she was also Clara Lawson, and she was also the woman who loved Milton with an entire heart that had survived enough to know exactly what it was choosing. She clicked her heels, and the horse moved forward into the lamplight, and Milton rode beside her, and the door opened before they reached it because Henry had heard the hooves and was waiting, because Henry always heard them coming and was always waiting, and he held the door wide with the easy warmth of a young man who had grown up in a house where love was not a scarcity but a practice, repeated daily, honest and ordinary and very large. Clara stepped inside. The voices rose to meet her. The lamplight held the whole house warm. The land spread out in the dark behind her, 420 acres, documented and registered, proven in open court before a judge and a journalist, and a room full of people who had not expected the outcome they received. Hers, and now theirs, and someday, piece by piece, the children's. All of it held together by a deed pressed against a chest on a spring morning in 1882, and the stairs that groaned, and the man who stood up when she came in and said, when she told him the court had never once ruled for a woman, that he would take the case.